Good afternoon, I'm Abe.
And I'm Frank, and today we're adumbrating the second half of Chapter 8, America Secedes from Empire, in Kennedy, Cohen, and Bailey's The American Pageant textbook. Joining us again this week is Catherine. Catherine, would you like to start us off?
Sure, I would love to. So in 1777, London officials adopted a complicated scheme for capturing the vital Hudson River Valley. If it was successful, it would sever New England, the heart of the colonies, from the rest of the colonies. The plan was such. General Burgoyne would push down the Lake Champlain route from Canada. General Howe's troops would meet him in New York if needed, and could advance up the Hudson and meet him in Albany. A third and much smaller British force, commanded by Colonel Barry St. Leger, would come up from the west by the way of Lake Ontario and the Mohawk Valley. However, Benedict Arnold, after a failure at Quebec, retreated slowly along the St. Lawrence back to Lake Champlain, where the British would have to win control of the lake before proceeding. The Brits stopped to build a huge force, while Arnold quickly assembled a tattered fleet from whatever boats he could find. His navy was destroyed, but he gained valuable time because winter set in and the British settled in Canada. This was important because they would have to wait anew till the next spring in order to start again. Had Arnold not contributed this daring and skill, the Brits would have most likely captured Ticonderoga and Burgoyne, and could have started from there and succeeded in his venture. Burgoyne began his mission with 7,000 troops and heavy baggage train consisting of a great number of officers' wives. Shout out to woman reference. General Howe, at a time when he could be starting up the Hudson, deliberately embarked for an attack on Philadelphia, which everyone found super weird. He wanted to force an encounter with Washington and leave the path wide open for Burgoyne's thrust. He thought he had enough time to keep Burgoyne if needed. Washington transferred his troops to Philadelphia, but he was defeated at Brandywine Creek and Germantown. Then, the fun-loving Howe settled down in Philadelphia, leaving Burgoyne to the dogs. Ben Franklin, our love, in Paris joked that Howe hadn't captured Philadelphia, Philadelphia had captured Howe. Washington finally retreated for winter at Valley Forge, where his troops froze in the cold, but a recently arrived Prussian drillmaster, Baron von Steuben, whipped them into shape. Burgoyne's doomed troops were bogged down, and the rebels swarmed in with a series of sharp engagements, pushing St. Leger's force back at Arinsky, while Burgoyne, unable to advance or retreat, surrendered his entire force at the Battle of Saratoga on October 17th, 1777. This was a landmark date. This was perhaps one of the most decisive battles in British and American history. The importance of Saratoga lay in the fact that afterwards, France sensed that America might actually win, and thus they came out to officially help America, the huge turning point of the war. So, Abe, can you tell me a little bit about how the French helped?
Of course. So France was eager to get revenge on Britain, and they secretly supplied the Americans throughout much of the war. The Continental Congress, the Americans, sent delegates to France, and the delegates were guided by this model treaty, which sought no political or military connections, but instead only commercial connections with the French. Ben Franklin played the diplomacy game with the French by wearing simple gray clothes and a coonskin cap to supposedly exemplify this raw, new America. So after the humiliation at Saratoga, remember it was a huge British defeat, the British offered the Americans a measure that gave them home rule, basically giving them everything they wanted except for independence. Now, after Saratoga, France was persuaded to enter the war against the British. The colonists obviously did not accept that deal with the British, so they took the French's help. Louis XIV's ministers argued that this was a perfect time to act, because if Britain regained control, then Britain might then try to capture the French West Indies for compensation for the war. So France in 1778 offered a treaty of alliance to the Americas, and they offered them everything that Britain had offered, plus recognition of independence. The Americans accepted the treaty with caution, since France was pro-Catholic. Remember, America was mostly Puritan. But since the Americans needed help, they took the treaty with euphoria. Now, Frank, could you tell me what happened with France's aid to the colonists?
Yeah, so with France's aid to the colonies, we saw that a simple war between an imperial master, England, and the colonies, America, became a wider war, more world war. In 1779, Spain and Holland entered the war against Britain. In 1780, good old Catherine the Great over here of Russia took the lead of organizing what's called the Armed Neutrality And this was basically stated that a bunch of countries would unite against England either through direct war or through commercial attacks. Britain, with the French now fighting them at seas, decided to finally evacuate Philadelphia and concentrate their forces in New York. And even though Washington attacked them at Monmouth on a blistering hot day in which scores of men died of sunstroke, the British escaped from New York relatively unscathed. Kathy, after international forces began to join the war, how did the War of Revolution play out?
So French reinforcements, commanded by Comte de Rochambeau, arrived in Newport, Rhode Island in 1780. Flares sometimes erupted between the Americans and the French as an aftermath of the French-Indian Wars. In 1780, feeling unappreciated and lured by British gold, General Benedict Arnold turned traitor. Remember, ladies, traitor danger. He decided to be a traitor by plotting with the British to sell out West Point. When the plot was discovered, he fled with the British, and luckily this plot was discovered just in time. When George Washington found out, he cried, "Whom can we trust now?" The British devised a plan to roll up the colonies and blaze through the South. In Charleston, South Carolina, fell in 1780. In the Carolinas, patriots bitterly fought their loyalist neighbors. However, in 1781, American riflemen wiped out British detachment at Kings Mountain, and then defeated a smaller force at Cowpens. At the Carolina Campaign of 1781, Quaker raised tactician General Nathaniel Greene distinguished himself with his strategy of delay. By slowly retreating and losing battles, but winning campaigns, he helped clear the British out of most of Georgia and South Carolina. So, can you tell me about the land frontier and sea frontiers?
Gladly. So 1777 was known as the Bloody Year on the frontier, as Indians went on a scalping spree against the colonists. Most of the Indians supported Britain and believed that if the British won, then it would stop the American expansion into the West and save Indian land. So Mohawk chief Joseph Brant, who was recently converted to Anglicanism, with his men ravaged the backcountry of Pennsylvania and New York until he was defeated by the Americans in 1779. In 1784, the pro-British Iroquois tribe signed the Treaty of Fort Stanwix, which was the first treaty between U.S. and an Indian nation. Under its terms, the Indians ceded most of their land. So, George Rogers Clark, who was an audacious frontiersman, floated down the Ohio River into where the weak British-influenced area, with about 175 men in 1778 and 1779, and then captured the forts of Kaskaskia, Cahokia, and Vincennes in quick succession of each other. Overall, throughout the entire war, the tiny American Navy never really hurt the British warships, but it did destroy British merchant shipping and carried the war into the waters around the British Isles. Swift privateers, which were basically privately owned armed ships, preyed on enemy shipping and captured many ships and forced them to sail in convoys. Privateers had the unfortunate effect of diverting manpower from the main war effort. However, the privateers were important and beneficial to the Americans in that they brought in urgently needed gold, harassed the enemy, and raised American morale by providing victories when victories were few for the Americans. Now, Frank, could you tell me why was the Battle of Yorktown considered so decisive?
The Battle of Yorktown was the turning point of the Revolutionary War. But before we get there, we need to remember that at this point, inflation is destroying the colonial economy, and the government was virtually bankrupt. That's why the privateers that Abe talked about were so important. They brought money into the treasury. Meanwhile, the British General Cornwallis had blundered into a trap at Yorktown. Retreating to Chesapeake Bay and assuming the British control of the seas would give him much-needed backup, Cornwallis instead was trapped by Washington's army, which had come 300 miles from New York, and Rochambeau's army, and the navy of the French general, Admiral de Grasse. After hearing the news of Cornwallis's defeat, Lord North cried, "Oh God, it's over." Because the British truly did believe that the Revolutionary War had ended against them. However, stubborn King George III wanted to continue the war, since he still had 54,000 troops in North America and 32,000 in the US, and fighting did not continue fighting did continue for a year after Yorktown. Especially in the South, America had won at this point. Kathy, could you explain to me how peace manifested itself in the fallout of the British defeat at Yorktown?
Indeed, many Brits were wary of the war, since they had suffered heavily in India and the West Indies. The island of Manakora in the Mediterranean, which had fallen, and the Rock of Gibraltar was tottering. So 3 American delegates were sent to Paris for a peace deal. They were Ben Franklin, John Adams, and my personal favorite, John Jay. Jay suspected that France would try to keep the U.S. cooped up east of the Alleghenies and keep America weak. Instead, Jay, thinking that the French would betray American ambition to satisfy those of Spain, secretly made separate overtures to London, against instructions from Congress, and came to terms quickly with the British, who were eager to entice one of their enemies from the alliance. Now, Abe, can you tell me a little bit more about the Treaty of Paris itself?
Yeah, so the Treaty of Paris was formed in 1783, and in the Treaty of Paris, Britain formally recognized U.S. independence and granted generous boundaries to the Americans. These boundaries stretch majestically to the Mississippi River in the west, the Great Lakes on the north, and to Spanish Florida on the south. The Americans were also allowed to retain some of their priceless fisheries of Newfoundland, which were previously set aside for the Canadians. Americans couldn't persecute the Loyalists remaining in the Americas after the war, though, and Congress could only recommend legislature that would return or pay for the confiscated Loyalist land that the Loyalists lost during the war. Now, Frank, could you further analyze the effects of the Revolutionary War for me?
I would love to. Britain ceded so much land because it was trying to entice America from its French alliance. Remember that George Rogers Clark had only conquered a small part of western land during his Ohio raids against the British forts. Also, during the time, the American-friendly Whigs were in control of Parliament, which was not the case several years later, meaning that Americans got a better deal than they would have either before or after the Whigs were in control. France approved the treaty, though with cautious eyes, since remember that they'd wanted to have a weak America who they could trade with, but that wouldn't threaten their commercial interests. In truth, America came out the big winner from this global war, and seldom, if ever, have any people been so favored. Thank you. Please like,
comment,
and subscribe. Catch you guys next time. Gentleman Johnny.